I'd like to welcome everybody tonight to the Suffolk webinar. Tonight, we're going to have Dr. Scott Greiner from Virginia Tech talk to us about ewe selection, productivity, and flock retention. Scott is an extension animal scientist at Virginia Tech. Virginia Tech itself has a sheep flock consisting of Suffolk sheep as well as other breeds. And if you are listening via Zoom, you can ask questions through the chat or question and answer section. If you're joining us on Facebook Live, you can go ahead and comment in the comment section, and we'll feed those questions into Scott throughout the presentation or at the end. With that, I'll go ahead and let you get started. Scott.
Thank you, Amanda. Pleasure to join you tonight, and thanks for the invitation to speak on this topic. I think it's one that's timely, and my goal tonight is to share some thoughts and maybe and get everybody kind of thinking about some various things as it relates to this topic. I've got my contact information here on my title slide. Feel free, if you don't get your question asked tonight, if I can help in any way down the road about this topic or something else, I'd be happy to, and feel free to reach out, and I'll bring this slide up again towards the end. So as Amanda mentioned, our topic tonight's ewe selection and productivity and flock retention, and really boil that down, it's about which ewes do we decide to cull, which replacement ewe lambs do we decide to keep, and that's kind of the two focus areas that we're going to talk about this evening, and the various topics that relate to those. So as we get started, to set the stage a little bit, I guess I'd ask you to kind of think a little bit about your production system and why you raise sheep. And several of the things that I think are relevant to this topic and that we'll visit about, the answers and kind of the key factors, you might say, will vary from one production system to another. Whether we raise Suffolk sheep, purebred Suffolk sheep, and our primary market is commercial rams, as indicated by one of these pictures on the slide. Perhaps we're raising Suffolk sheep, and we've got youth associated in the show ring, or we're showing sheep, whether those are fitted Suffolks, perhaps they're slick shorn purebred Suffolks, perhaps they're club lambs. Kind of three different facets of our industry that are all extremely important. Of course, we've got the commercial sector that Suffolks play a large role in, particularly as sires, and then of course a number of us, and growing in popularity, is our ability to direct market lamb and lamb products, and so the carcass end of things can become important as well. So there's a large number of production type systems. There's a lot of traits involved. There's a lot of factors involved, and there's a lot of ways that we can view this topic. And so I ask you to think about what your own situation is and how these things apply to your production system, to your goals, to your management, because that will really dictate how you apply some of these concepts, and maybe how you approach answering some of the questions that I'm going to propose to you as we move throughout this topic this evening. So what I'm going to start with when we talk about this topic, I guess, ask you to think a little bit about what is the ideal ewe? What does she look like? What does she do? I think that's important, and I don't think it matters a great deal what your production system is. I think we could agree on several concepts. I think, and important things. I'll take a stab at answering that. I wish we had a live audience that we could interact with this. Amanda, it'd be a great discussion to have. But I think first and foremost, she lambs. She conceives and gets pregnant. She successfully lambs as a yearling, and then she lambs every year thereafter on schedule within our defined breeding system, and she does that on a regular basis and does that unassisted. Okay, that's kind of the first step. From that, she not only has a live lamb, but she raises one, and she weans multiple lambs, hopefully. And those lambs fit the demands of whatever our marketplace might be and whoever our customers are. Okay, and that could, as we covered already, that could be a wide variety of things. That could be a show sheep. That could be a ram that's going to be used as a terminal sire in a commercial flock. That could be a market lamb that we are direct marketing or selling commercially. Okay, all different marketplaces, all different kinds of sheep, and require different things. But ultimately, she's got to produce a lamb that fits our marketplace and satisfies whoever our customer might be. Thirdly, she's highly adapted to what our environment is and what our management is. I'm a native of Iowa. Of course, as you know, Amanda lives there. Her environment and where she's raising sheep and where I currently live in outside Blacksburg, Virginia, is a totally different environment. And so our sheep need to be adapted to that in terms of climatic conditions, in terms of how we manage them, how intensively or how extensively we choose to manage our sheep. Those are all things that we need to pay attention to and make that ewe work for us and work in that particular environment. And if she does all those things, hopefully this last one comes together, and that means she's profitable, that she optimizes revenue, generates enough revenue through her lamb crop to offset her costs of production. And very importantly, she does that year after year after year over a long productive life. And so those are kind of the key things, I think, in terms of what the ideal ewe does. And so as we think about identifying ewes that maybe don't fit our system, how we might approach culling ewes or how we might approach selecting our ewe lambs, ultimately, I think it boils down to kind of this job description, if you will, in terms of what that ewe's intended to do in our system. Related to that, we can associate several traits that correspond with the ideal ewe. And I've made a list here on this particular slide. I would not say this is a comprehensive list. There's probably some other things we could add to this, but certainly fertility and reproductive soundness list. That's the ewe's fundamental #1 important job, and that's to get pregnant within our defined breeding season, whatever breeding season that might be. Strong mothering ability, the ability to have lambs, the ability to nurture them, to convey some lamb vigor, and hopefully promote those lambs when they're born to get up and nurse and do that as unattended as possible. Obviously, milk production in terms of her ability to raise multiple births and add growth to those lambs. And then ultimately, some of the convenience traits that we know are very important. The quality of her udder, which is everything from the udder shape to teat size and teat placement. A small refined teat that's placed well versus a very large pendulous teat that's difficult for newborn lambs to nurse on makes a big difference. We'll talk about some health and soundness issues and things like what her mature size is certainly relates to our production costs. It relates to her fleshing ability and ability to maintain condition on our forages and in our production system, whatever that might be, which is ultimately related to, can be related to reproductive rate. And then lastly, what's her attitude like? Does she have a quiet disposition? Or is she one that's the ewe that's continually challenging the fence line or the gate or whatever the case might be? As I get older, I've learned that life's too short to put up with sheep that aren't cooperative. And so I'm probably not as tolerant as I used to be, regardless of what their quality might be. So maybe the most important thing that I'd probably share with you tonight relative to importance is all these things and all the things we're going to talk about ultimately boil down to our ability to keep some effective records. I know record keeping is not a topic that's terribly appealing and really fun to talk about, but it's extremely important. I know I'm as guilty as any producer out there in terms of maybe not being as diligent as I should be about writing things down. A lot of those things go in my head and I think I'll remember, but when it comes this time of year, we lamb in early winter, mostly January and early February. And I'll remember that ewe that I had trouble with, but if I don't put it down in my lambing book, chances are that's not going to get remembered and it's not going to be used in the decision making like it should be. So take good records on these things relative to particularly the convenience traits, things like mothering ability, milk production, lamb vigor, udder quality, all those kinds of things are really, really important. And if we've got some records, then we can begin to utilize those in some fashion to our benefit moving forward. I'm going to spend a little time here at the outset and talk a little bit about culling ewes. And I thought it'd be useful to maybe look at what are the common factors that producers cull ewes for. And so probably the best piece of data that we can call on to do that is USDA does the National Animal Health Monitoring System, which is a survey of sheep producers. It's done periodically. This data is a little bit old, but I'm not sure that it's probably changed dramatically over the years. It's probably been fairly consistent, but this is across the country, of course, and in a variety of production systems, a variety of breeds, and a variety of environments. But the number one overwhelming factor that ewes are culled on is based on age. Okay, and we'll talk a little bit more about that in a minute. That does not surprise me. At the same time, I think there's some things to think about relative to that factor. The second one is failure to lamb, whether that's for any reason. Failure to lamb would be failure to conceive and get pregnant. Failure to lamb might be related to abortions or some other cause that you in fact got pregnant, but for some reason did not lamb. Third on that list was teeth problems. I think that's an environmental thing and can be related to age, obviously, but in our environment, we don't see too many teeth problems. I know as you move across the country, and we might have some representation on the webinar tonight from folks from other parts of the country, they're a little drier, more arid environments where they've got more sand and got a little harsher environment relative to teeth, that could become an issue. Hardback and mastitis are both things that concern us relative to udder soundness. Hardback, of course, being fibrous tissue that's in one side or the other, and perhaps both of the udder that prevents that ewe from actually producing milk. And then mastitis, of course, is a bacterial infection of the udder that typically occurs during lactation. But both of those, of course, can have consequences. Mastitis can lead to hardback. Hardback can be caused by several things, including OPP and some others. And of course, mastitis can render an udder, if severe enough and not treated, can render an udder hard or unuseful in future lambings. And then last on that list was poor mothering or poor mothering potential. The list is a little longer than that. Actually, there's several other things that are included in the survey, but those were the significant ones. And I thought it was interesting, the average replacement rate or average cull rate was 14% across the United States, which quite a bit of variation in that, depending on what region of the country you're in and maybe your flock size. But a little bit more on ewe age. Why is ewe age a significant culling factor? The main reason for that is that we do know that ewes are most productive when they're 3 to 6 years old. And by productivity, we mean the number of their prolificacy, the number of lambs that they give birth to, as well as their milk production potential peaks and is at its optimum between 3 and 6 years of age. Ewes that are younger than that tend to have less multiple births and don't milk quite as well. Ewes that get to be 7+, we also know are not as prolific. In other words, they don't have as many lambs, and we know they don't produce as much milk. And so kind of a standard culling practice amongst many folks is when ewes get up to that 7 to 8 years old and kind of out of that prime of their life, if you will, they're on the cull list. I would say that this is one of those things that's very highly variable across flocks, across production systems, across management systems. I know that here at Virginia Tech, we've got some purebred Suffolk ewes, which are 8 and 9 years old and doing extremely well. And so my personal philosophy has always been, I think it's more important to monitor those ewes' productivity and how they're doing, and use that as the primary decision-making factor relative to if they should be kept or culled. As that ewe exhibits signs of loss of productivity, lamb vigor, maintaining body condition, her lamb's ability to grow relative to its contemporaries from younger ewes, perhaps that's a sign that she's reached her peak. As long as she, particularly if we look at what the lamb market's been the last few years, as long as she's got a sound udder, she's productive herself by our standards, and she doesn't give us any trouble, more than likely she's going to be profitable given where we've been in the lamb cycle and the way lamb prices have been. So that's kind of an individual decision, but I think the key factor is to define how productive she is based on your definition of productivity. And we'll talk just a little more about how we might go estimating that in a little bit. Some of those health issues that we talked about, we talked a little about udder health, and that really comes down to hardback and mastitis. Other things that give us fits as shepherds are those ewes that are chronic with hoof problems, whether that be foot rot or scald, or simply ewes that for whatever reason tend to have more hoof issues and require more frequent trimming. Another one that resonates pretty strong with lots of us is internal parasites. The research tells us that most of our internal parasite problems are harbored by and caused by a small percentage of our flock. Another way to say that is that I think if we are all cognizant about FOMACHA scores and monitoring parasitism in our flocks, we've probably got a handful of sheep in our flock, which are much more heavily parasitized than some of the others. And so identifying them, excuse me, might be a factor that we use relative to ewe retention and culling, depending on what our environment is and how big of a problem that might be in our flock. The last one on this list is prolapses, and of course those occur in several different forms: rectal prolapse, vaginal prolapse, and uterine prolapse. All of those, particularly rectal and vaginal prolapse, have some genetic component, and probably are reason enough to put a red X by those ewes. And certainly vaginal and uterine prolapses, ewes that have those can be prone to those at future lambings or parturitions as well. So those are things to consider as we look at health issues in the ewe flock. I think an important question to ask about all these traits is, are they heritable? Okay, and heritability simply relates to how much of that trait is related to genetics. You're probably all somewhat familiar with the heritability of several of our production traits. We know that reproductive traits are lowly heritable. The reason for that is that the environment has a great deal to do with number of eggs that ewe ovulates, season of the year, some of those kinds of things, as well as nutritional status. We generally think about growth and maternal traits being moderately heritable, meaning that if we place selection pressure on those, we select for more milk, we select for more growth, we can effectively move those traits in the direction that we'd like them to. Carcass traits, of course, are highly heritable. If we can measure differences in carcass traits, use those in the selection program, we can certainly change carcass traits in a hurry, because lots of the difference that we observe in carcass merit is directly attributable to differences in genetic merit and controlled by genetics. So I just used that slide as an introduction. I wanted to talk a little bit about some of the convenience traits. Unfortunately, there's not a lot of data in the sheep in the sheep industry. So I'm going to call on some data from our friends in the cattle industry. And because a fair amount of research has been done there, and I'll try and use the analogy, and I think we're safe in using the analogy that several of these traits that we can consider convenience traits, whether that's feet and leg structure, udder attachment, teat size, those types of things are heritable. And the take-home message there is that if we've got sheep that have poor udders and bad teats, or have foot soundness problems repeatedly, or are more prone to parasitism, we know there is genetic control to some extent to all those traits. Okay, so if we allow those ewes that are problematic in those areas to persist in our flock, we keep daughters of those ewes, more than likely some of those issues are going to continue to persist in our flock. If we can identify them, make record of them, if we can place selection pressure on some of those convenience traits, just like we do growth and some of our other more objectively measured traits, we can make some progress. I know that parasitism is a good example. If we place pressure on and we select for sheep that are more parasite tolerant, sure enough, we're going to improve the parasite tolerance of our flock. And we can draw a similar analogy to some of these other traits that are important to us as well. Amanda, do we have any questions or keep rolling?
We're good right now.
Okay, good. So let's talk about culling ewes. All right. And I've kind of broke this down into, at least from my perspective, I put this into kind of 3 different categories. Okay. And we'll just call this category 1, potential reasons to cull ewes. All right. The first 2 of those, and I've got these in red for a reason, failure to breed or failure to wean lambs, in my opinion, is a surefire reason to cull a ewe. That ewe has no ability to make us money if she doesn't wean a lamb that we can market in some fashion, regardless of what our marketing system is. Okay. And so I think the thing that we sometimes tend to forget, and I'm guilty of it in my own flock at home, we've got what we think are our best ewes. Perhaps she misses a year. We make an excuse for her and we keep her again. And sure enough, she misses a second year. Well, we've got another year's worth of, a whole nother year's worth of production expense in her with nothing to pay for it. And so I think these 2 factors here in red are things that we need to concentrate on as sheep producers. The other thing that I would add to that, if we look at what the sheep market has been, maybe not quite as strong right now, but back in the winter, ewes were bringing in excess of $300 a head. Cull ewes were bringing in excess of $300. And so there's very little reason to keep them when they don't have a token at side, a lamb that's going to wean and generate revenue for us. So those are kind of 2 surefire things, in my opinion, that we need to focus on. Poor mothering ability is another one. Okay. Those ewes which simply are poor mothers, that's a heritable trait. I'm convinced the data supports that. If we force those ewes and we select for ewes that are better mothers, we're going to improve that trait. Poor lamb vigor is a little bit similar. Okay. And there's a whole number of factors we could probably talk about related to lamb vigor. Strategies like crossbreeding are used to improve that, and for sure we'll do that. In our purebred breeding systems, we sometimes purposely inbreed to take advantage of strong or favorable genetics in a pedigree, and we line those up or we stack up those genetics. That inbreeding contributes negatively to lamb vigor, so we have to be careful with that. Poor udder quality. Okay. Ewes that have half a bag, ewes that have big pendulous balloon-like teats that lambs can't get their mouths around and nurse, and we have to milk them out. I think we have to think long and hard about that, how valuable they are actually to our production system, how much time and energy we have to spend in terms of making those ewes functional. And that's a personal decision that we all have to make. If we purposely want bottle lambs or lambs that we have to raise on milk replacer, I personally do not at my house. And therefore ewes that don't have a good sound udder on both sides don't stay around, because I don't have time for, or the patience, or the energy for bottle lambs. So again, think about that in your production system and how that might work. Okay. Rectal or vaginal prolapse, we touched on that just a little bit. Those two things we know have a genetic component. And so I would recommend not keeping ewe lambs out of ewes that have rectal or vaginal prolapse, to minimize our chances of propagating that further in our flock. And then lastly, those ewes that got a bad disposition. Okay. And they're just ornery to be around. Everyone will have a different definition of that, but it's certainly very important. Most of us probably work full-time jobs off the farm and probably don't have time to mess with those ewes that aren't fun to be around. And so all of us will have a little different tolerance level, but it's certainly something to keep in mind. And I think the important thing to keep in mind and recognize is that most all these traits are heritable. And that means if we keep sons or daughters out of ewes which have some of these less than desirable traits and things that we'd like to select against, they'll also be more prone to these problems. And so think about that as you think about culling ewes and which ones deserve to be on the cull list and which ones deserve to be on the keep around list. Kind of the second segment of traits that I think about as it relates to culling ewes are ewes that maybe don't fit our system quite as well. Maybe they're chronic late lambers. You know, for whatever reason, they're not as fertile early in the breeding season. They tend to lamb in that last cycle when we have the ram in. Evaluate how those fit your production system. You know, by those lambs being later, they're always going to be smaller. They're always going to be a little bit behind in terms of their development and size. And so depending on our production system, they may or may not be a good fit in terms of what we're trying to do, but that's another potential thing to look at. Those ewes that are out of sync relative to their reproductive cycle. Okay, foot issues and parasites, I've already touched on that. Those are two things that I think we could do. We could do ourselves a world of good if we do some good record keeping on that. A good example is internal parasites, is keeping track of FAMACHA scores. If we're using a selective deworming program, we simply record FAMACHA scores. We find those ewes if we have those that are the repeat offenders that continually need dewormed. Maybe we've got that subset of ewes which never need deworming. I would say that based on practical experiences with our flocks here, that will be the case in nearly every flock. And so doing something about those chronic offenders will help us moving down the road. And then lastly, kind of getting into the reason that we're in the sheep business in the first place is the performance of those lambs, the suitability of those lambs, the quality of those lambs relative to our production system. We might measure that in terms of weight. We might measure that in terms of their phenotype and quality. There's a whole bunch of different ways we can measure that. But really, oftentimes that probably is secondary to all those other traits that we talked about. For most, in most of our cases, relative to the value of those lambs. So production records, which ones might we look at? Ideally, we'd have a full complement of production records that are important to us in our flock. This set just happens to be the Virginia Tech Suffolk flock that I pulled up here. This is this year's lamb crop, and so those lambs are all weaned. So I've got adjusted weaning ratios on there. I've got the pedigree of the ewe, number of lambs that she's had. Of course, this is simply the 2022 winter lambing. But I could go back and find the production record on each one of these individual ewes and kind of look at her history in our flock in terms of how she's performed relative to lambing rate, relative to lamb growth. At weaning, as those lambs get older, we'll collect 120-day post-weaning weights. That'll be added to this spreadsheet, so to give us an idea of that ewe's productivity. Okay, I think it's important that when we're collecting weights and we're looking at records, that we make sure we use those in a proper fashion. And that means adjust them. Weaning weights, for example, we adjust them for age of the ewe, we adjust them for sex of the lamb, we adjust them for age of the lamb. Those are all real important. So we're comparing apples to apples, particularly as we're using that from a decision-making standpoint about ewe performance and ewe productivity. So key factor here is decide which of those traits are a priority for you. We're in the business of selling commercial rams here in our flock. And so these growth traits are highly important, along with parasite tolerance and carcass merit are kind of the key objectives in our flock. Even better than those individual records would be something like NSIP EBVs, which are a direct estimate of the genetic merit of that sheep. I've just put the spreadsheet on our mature ewes up here. And so we can go through here pretty quickly, and I can identify the ewes that are the poorest in our flock relative to growth traits. I can identify the ewes that are the poorest relative to loin muscle area. I can identify the ewes which are the best. Okay, but if we talk about culling and maintaining flock numbers, and we can use this data, it's extremely useful to us in terms of trying to advance the average genetic merit of our flock forward. If we can peel off the bottom end relative to whatever performance trait that is, for us, that's growth in combination with some carcass merit, and we can use the indexes that NSIP provides. I'm not going to go too much into detail on that, Amanda. I know you've had some webinars on NSIP, but extremely useful tool. And really the very beneficial thing about it is that it's identifying genetic differences. Okay, if I go back to the previous slide, we've done our best to remove environmental differences, but there's still some environmental contributions to what's happening here with this individual performance data. On NSIP, that's been removed statistically. And so we're looking at differences in genetic merit, okay? And so a very, very useful tool. I think an important question to all of us as we think about this is, how do we measure productivity? How do we measure how good of a job that ewe is doing? Okay. There's different ways we can do this. Kind of the classic way, that we thought about from an industry perspective, is pounds of lamb weaned, okay, as a measurement of ewe productivity, because that takes into account that ewe's fertility. In other words, how many eggs did she ovulate? And per prolificacy, how many of those eggs got fertilized, carried to term, and lambed, okay? Takes into account her mothering ability, her milk production, which is directly related to how heavy those lambs will be at weaning. We put all those together and sum that up. How many pounds of lamb did she wean? Okay. I think a pretty effective measure for most of us in terms of ewe productivity, we might think about that one step further in terms of how many pounds of lamb does she market. Okay, that's really pounds of lamb weaned plus post-weaning growth and health of those lambs. So survivability from weaning to market would be the two additional factors that we'd consider there. I would guess that there's several of us on this call tonight that a measure that might be important to us is the total value of the lambs that we market out of that ewe. I think that's particularly something that we can look at from a standpoint of seed stock breeders. If we're selling purebred sheep, whether that's rams, maybe that's show sheep, maybe that's club lambs, okay? What's the value of those lambs that we marketed out of that ewe? Because the reality is that in today's marketplace, in some of our production systems, and I'll just use my own flock as an example, my own flock at home, okay? We've got 2 or 3 breeds and we sell some club lambs and merchandise some females. But I can have a ewe have a single, and if she produces a very high quality lamb in my marketplace that sells extremely well, she might be more valuable and productive to me by my definition of productivity than a ewe that lamb next to her that had triplets, whose lambs I ended up selling as commercial market lambs and didn't have as much value. Okay, so I think we need to think about this. My point here is think about this in your production system. How do you measure productivity? And fundamentally, reproduction, ability to mother up, the ability to raise a lamb, all those things remain important regardless of our production system. It kind of changes a little bit in terms of what drives the price we get for those lambs, and how we market them might change how we define productivity to some extent. Okay, but some of those fundamental traits that we've already talked about are always going to be important. Okay, so use a measurement that fits your production system. And for the most part, as long as those ewes are sound, they meet our basic soundness parameters, they're productive in our system, however we define that, they can probably stay around as long as they continue to pull their weight and continue to be productive by our definition. Okay, those are kind of my thoughts and food for thought as we talk about this topic. Okay, I think we're always faced with that decision to call or not to call. I like to think about this from an economic perspective. Did that ewe pay her way? In other words, did she do a good enough job to generate enough revenue to justify her existence and her expenses for the year? And will she continue to do that in the future? I think those are really the ultimate questions to ask. If she's only got half a bag, that's a pretty difficult proposition to do. If she didn't get pregnant and she didn't wean lambs, there's no way that she paid her own way. And so those answers can be fairly simple. It's a little more complicated for some other things. So there's a lot of other factors that might go into it. And each of us kind of has a different set of parameters that we tend to think about. The pedigree of that sheep, how unique is it? How valuable is it to us? Is she different? Is she something unique, or is she fairly average in our flock? How willing are we to make exceptions? In today's current economic climate, I'd say it's a little more difficult to justify exceptions based on what our production costs are likely to be with feed and fuel and everything else. The upside of that's the sheep market's been strong and hopefully will remain strong. So we've got that working in our favor. So and then we always ask the question, the sentimental value. We've all got the favorite ewe. She's going to get old and she's going to not be productive at some point in time. And so when do we pull the trigger on that one that has sentimental value and has done a good job paying her way? So those are all questions we have to answer for ourselves within our own production system. Okay. Let's wind up a little bit and talk a little bit about replacements. And again, your flock goals are vitally important here in terms of what you're trying to do, marketing wise, management wise. What are your resources? Think about what you're good at, what your flock strengths and weaknesses are, what are the opportunities for improvement, and what traits go along with that. Those are kind of key factors in terms of which Ulams we need to keep. We want to select those that have the best chance of addressing our weaknesses and moving us forward. That's always the goal. The question is, how do we identify those? One of the questions that always comes up is, should we buy or raise replacements? And I think that's a valid question. A few thoughts about that. Of course, raising our own replacements from a biosecurity and health standpoint is the safest bet. Those sheep are already in our flock. We've got our existing health program. We really don't have too many worries about biosecurity as opposed to bringing sheep in from an external source. We always have the risk of bringing in differences in terms of health and disease, etc. Our sheep are more than likely best suited for our environment, best adapted because they were raised in that environment. And so they're probably best suited to fit our environment. We often know way more about the sheep we raise than the sheep that we can buy. That's not always the case, but oftentimes it's the case that we're hard pressed to find sheep that we know more about. And then there's the cost. Can we raise them cheaper or can we buy them cheaper? That will vary for each one of us depending on what our production system and our costs of production are. Purchasing Ulams, I would say one of the things to think about, it is an option to upgrade genetics, provided we can identify superior genetics to what we already have for those traits that are important to us. And I think a key factor there is being able to identify those traits, okay, objectively. Can we buy ewes that are better than we already have, okay? Buying ewe lambs might simplify our management at home. Of course, we'd have the revenue from all the ewe lambs if we marketed them under some other system other than keeping them as replacements. That's additional revenue. And I already mentioned the biosecurity and health issue. When we buy any sheep, we're not only buying the sheep, we're buying the health program that comes with it, both the positive things and the negative things. And then, of course, there's cost on this side as well. What are those ewe lambs worth relative to what we can raise them for? How much additional value do they have to us compared to our own replacements? So all very important questions to think through as we make this decision. Okay. Couple ways to look at selecting replacements. We can look at performance records and visual appraisal. Historically, a combination of the two is probably the best, and not put all of our eggs in one basket or the other. But performance records wise, there's a whole host of things we can look at. Those individual performance things that are important. Age is always one. We want those ewe lambs old enough that they're going to reach puberty and they're going to breed within our specified breeding season. And then traits that are important in our flock: growth, carcass traits, perhaps some genotypes like codon 171, other things like the dwarf gene and various other things that are out there that we have genetic tests and genotypes for. Parasite resistance. Couple that with pedigree information, which goes back to our earlier discussion, knowing something about the sire and dam and their history relative to those traits that are important in use: fertility, mothering ability, udder quality, lambing ease, foot soundness. Okay, so the ability to identify good pedigrees that work in our environment is extremely valuable. Okay, and that can be a challenge to do when we're buying outside sheep. It's much easier to do internally within our own production system. Identify those ewes that are productive and work well, keep replacements out of them, and more than likely we increase our chances of them being productive as well. And then ultimately breeding values, right? Those are our best tools from a genetic selection standpoint because they're estimates of true genetic differences between sheep. So we can very rapidly and very objectively change traits that are economically important to us through breeding values using something like NSIP. Okay. On the phenotypic side, visual appraisal, of course, an awful lot of us merchandise sheep relative to visual appraisal. That's been very historic and still very important from our industry standpoint. Feet and leg structure is always important. I think here diagrammed, there's some pretty severe cases of differences in structural quality and structural soundness. As long as we avoid sheep from a practical standpoint, we avoid sheep that have major problems, whether that's weak pasterns or bucked over front ends, or they're bow-legged behind or extremely straight. Other than the aesthetic value of that might be important from our marketing system standpoint, from a real world productivity standpoint, there's very few sheep that have soundness problems in feet and legs. I'm not suggesting that they don't exist, but the percentage of those sheep which are simply unsound structurally is not very high. Now, mouth soundness is certainly a different story. Those other things that we talked about, udders, udder quality, breed character, fleece quality, lack of black fiber, those kinds of things are also things to consider. And then of course, conformation. What does that sheep look like? And the importance of conformation will be dictated by its importance in your marketing system. For many of us, it's quite important. And for some of us, it's not quite as important. Some of the more objective traits like growth rate, like individual performance, probably have more value. But so conformation is always important. The extent to which it's important relative to some of the more objectively measured traits will vary for each one of our production systems. So one of the key factors in approaching Ulam selection is how many do we need? Generally, we replace 15 to 25% of the ewe flock annually. I mentioned earlier that 14% is the national average. And so keeping enough ewe lambs back to potentially breed and develop, that's going to replace that 15% of our ewe flock is important. It's always wise to keep a few extra and develop a few extra to help further identify which ones of those best meet our goals. One of the real simple approaches to take is to establish minimum criteria, okay? And by that, they have to reach this baseline, or they have to reach this bar to be considered a replacement. That might be an age requirement. That could be a minimum performance requirement, depending on your trait, whichever traits we deem important. If that's weaning weight, for example, we might have a minimum weaning performance they have to achieve. They have to have minimums relative to phenotype, if that's important in our production system. And then ask ourselves, where are we at relative to moving our flock forward? Do our potential ewe lambs meet our criteria? And if they don't, we've probably got a whole nother topic to talk about, and that would be sire selection, because our ewe lambs, of course, are largely represented by the sires that we use, the rams that we use. And so it's also a proxy, if you will, relative to the job that our rams are doing in improving the quality of our flock, however we define that. Okay. So a few thoughts on ewe lamb development. Make sure we just feed and separate those from market lambs. The reason we want to do that is avoid those ewe lambs getting excessively fat. We know that excessive fat deposition in the udder during the developmental phase can be detrimental to future milk production and future udder quality. And so we want to grow those ewe lambs out and avoid them getting excessively fat, breed them at 7 to 8 months and to lay them when they're yearlings. There's lots of data out there that supports breeding ewe lambs to lamb first at a year of age or thereabouts in terms of their lifetime productivity. The data supports that, and certainly the quicker we can get them in production, the better chance they are at being profitable in their lifetime for us. And the more quickly they generate revenue and offset those costs of developing them and making them a Ulam, a breeding female to begin with. We generally use 60% of mature weight at breeding, okay, as a guideline. So those Ulams need to grow at a rate that they're going to reach that 60% of their mature weight by the time we turn rams with them when they're 7 to 8 months old. Okay. Through gestation, they need to gain 35 to 40 pounds. And so they need to be managed and grown and fed separately from our mature ewe flock, because they've not only got requirements for gestation, they've got additional requirements for growth because they're still maturing themselves. So it's real important to manage them correctly, particularly from an energy standpoint. But protein's also important. They have higher mineral requirements than do mature ewes on a percentage basis. And so a good trace mineral program is really important, and utilizing our best feedstuffs because they have the highest nutritional requirements is always a good suggestion. And so feed them our best hay, give them our best nutrition because they're the ones in the most need. And then if at all possible, even during lactation, if we can feed those ewe lambs and their progeny, their lambs separately from our mature ewes, that's beneficial. So to kind of wind things up, I guess my main thoughts on this topic are on this slide. So cull are unproductive or lowly productive ewes, and I think the key to that is our records, and also the key is how we define productivity in our flock, and doing that in appropriate fashion to our production system. We know many of the problems that we have in ewes are heritable. They have a genetic component, and so we need to pay close attention to those and keep replacements out of our very best ewes as defined by our records and how we define productivity. And lastly, do our best to propagate, find, identify, and generate the ideal ewe. With that, Amanda, I'd be happy to answer any questions that might have popped up or any discussion that the group would like to have. I appreciate everyone's attendance.
All right, great. So again, for anybody who's joining us via Zoom, you can send questions in via the chat box or question and answer. If you're on Facebook, go ahead and type those in the comment section, and we'll watch for those to come in that way. There are a few questions. The first is dealing with ewe lambs and lambing out ewe lambs. What type of expectation should you have for first-time lambers?
Expectations relative to
I think
pregnancy
relative
rate,
to
lambing rate.
I think it's relative to, you know, keeping them, considering that they're meant to stay around another year. You know, if they have some attitude problems, or maybe I think maybe as I read it, if they're only have one lamb, you know, what should the expectations or the bar be set as high as those 3 to 6 year old productive ewes?
Well, I think the important thing there is that first-time lambers, number one, they're not going to be as productive and prolific, and so number of lambs born is going to be less on average. Okay, that's going to be true for a yearling ewe and a 2-year-old ewe, and all the way up till she gets to be about 3, and then kind of at her peak from 3 to 6, as we talked about. Same thing for milk production. Okay, so that yearling ewe is not going to wean as big and stout and growthy a lamb simply because she doesn't milk as well. Everything else being equal. So from that standpoint, yes, our bar is a little different. And I think you talk to many shepherds that a ewe lamb, a yearling ewe having a single lamb is just fine. You know, let her get into production, figure out what being a productive ewe is all about, do a good job raising a a single lamb and then see where that goes down the road. So I would agree with the fact that yes, our bar is not quite as high on a first time a yearling ewe as it is a mature ewe for sure.
Next question. In terms of fertility, what are your thoughts with AI? If a ewe is AI'd and doesn't breed, still cull her?
So I guess my personal thought on that is, a ewe that we set up and we AI laparoscopically, there's an awful lot going on there that, for lack of a better way to say it, that we're intervening with Mother Nature, and lots of things can happen there that are not at the fault of the ewe, in terms of her ability to conceive to that AI. And so being a little bit off in terms of timing, there's a whole host of things which, can cause that ewe to be open. And so I would not necessarily cull that ewe based on that. Now, most often we'll turn a cleanup ram in with them. And those ewes, provided everything, the health's good, providing everything's normal, those ewes should recycle, and they should have the ability to conceive naturally through a cleanup ram. Okay. Interestingly, and I'll just mention this, Amanda. I think there's some anecdotal evidence out there. I don't know of any studies that have been done that have been published, but I can call on data that does exist in the cattle world, that for those of us that are AIing, the longer that we AI, okay, so if we just look at year 1 AI when we start versus year 2 versus year 3, 4, 5, 6, what we should see is that our conception rates over time go up. Okay. In other words, our ewes get more responsive and better acclimated to that system, partially because of natural selection that's happening, and so on. So I'm unaware of that data and sheet. I think we're getting to the point that we can start to look at that data, but it does exist clearly in the cattle industry. And while we're not completely comparing apples to apples there, from the standpoint of setting those ewes up in terms of synchronization and those kind of things, that's all very similar, but something to maybe watch and keep in mind as you move forward.
How many cycles should someone expect a ewe to be bred in when you're turning them out with rams? 1, 2, 3, 4. What's a good rule of thumb?
Ideally 1, hopefully by 2, not more than 3.
Okay. What kind of feeding program do you recommend for replacement ewe lambs during growth? This individual has never separated their lambs before, and they're looking for a better feeding program to try.
So that will depend a little bit on your production system, your environment, and available resources. I mean, I can tell you, let me answer that. I'll answer that for my region of the country where I exist and live. Generally, ewe lambs are post-weaning, they're weaned, and after weaning, a very common practice is to put those ewe lambs out on grass, continue to feed them, and so they're gaining somewhere around 1/2 to 2/3 of a pound a day, and I'm talking about blackface, Suffolk and Suffolk cross sheep. And when I'm saying this, and so that's accomplished through you know, obviously high quality forage, which we have an abundance of this time of year, and moving in all the way up to midsummer when it gets hot and tends to dry up. But and then supplemented with around 2% of their body weight in a high energy grain, corn or corn gluten feed or some commercial product that's like that. That's a very common Ulam development program in our environment. So depending on what your available feedstuffs are, where you live, and what's available to you will dictate that to some extent.
You talked a little bit about sire impact on how productive his ewe lambs are. For someone who is looking to purchase a new ram with the intent to keep lots of replacement females, what are some things that the buyer should ask the breeder or take into consideration or make important decisions on the data when purchasing a ram?
That's a great question. So I'll start by answering. In an ideal world, that ram would have performance records of some sort available to us as the buyer. Really, the only records that are informative to us that are objective are NSIP data, which estimates his daughter's potential for milk production, for prolificacy, and maternal traits. Okay. In absence of that, what we can do is ask the breeder, start with that ewe's mother and her maternal line. What has been his experience with that ewe and ewes bred like her, relative to their maternal ability and those traits that are important to you? How has that been in his flock as a whole? And what does he anticipate this ram to be like in that regard, based on how he's bred and how sheep in the flock you're buying for are bred? What might be his expectations? Those would be the questions that I'd ask, Amanda.
All right. Another question, assuming that you have a ewe and she's deemed a keeper after lambing and her lamb has been weaned, what are some things that one should manage during the period of time that the ewe is drying up to ensure that she won't have any udder or milking issues during the following lambing season? Or how, I guess, what kind of management would you look at during that time, or what could impact something that was working well when she had a lamb?
Yep. So really the question's about strategies to wean lambs and minimize the problems with ewes relative to mastitis or udder quality, right?
Yes.
So a couple important factors here are, what our goal is as we're in the process of getting ready to wean those lambs, what we want to do is change that ewe's nutritional plane of nutrition and force that ewe basically to shut down milk production. Okay. How do we do that? Okay. What causes ewes to milk? And there's 3 or 4 factors. One factor is age of the lamb. In other words, what stage of lactation is she in? Okay. And so ewes reach their maximum milk potential somewhere around 4 weeks of lactation. Okay. They kind of build up to that. After that point in time, they begin to go down. Okay. Naturally. Okay. And so we generally think about weaning lambs at 60 days of age, kind of on the early end. You can wean them a little earlier than that. but 60 days is a common age, 60 to 70 days. If we're in a pretty intensive production system, okay? So by then that ewe is actually reducing her milk production. She hasn't shut off milk production by any stretch, but it's dramatically reduced than it compared to what it was a few weeks earlier. Okay, so that happens naturally. Okay, other things that we can do to facilitate that is get those lambs to rely less on the milk from the ewe and more on other sources of nutrition. And the way we classically do that is through creep feeding. Okay, and I'm assuming that we're talking about kind of intensively managed sheep that those ewes are being fed pretty good to optimize milk production and so forth. That's kind of my assumption in the question. And so making sure that we get those lambs introduced to creep early, get them started on feed, get them a highly palatable creep ration, and monitor that creep consumption very closely. And as those lambs get older, ewe milk production should naturally begin to decrease. At the same time, those lambs should eat more creep, okay, and rely less on the ewe's milk production. Okay, those are kind of the underlying factors that are going on. So the other things that we can do to help that ewe reduce milk production is back her nutrition off, okay, and that means cutting grain, supplemental high energy feed out of her diet. That's mainly grain. Okay, we can also reduce hay quality or forage quality. Okay, so we want to reduce energy in particular to force that ewe to reduce milk production. Okay, she needs nutrition to produce milk, so we're going to try and limit that. Okay, as we're doing that, there's all kinds of strategies out there that work for different folks. I would recommend I would reduce grain intake over a period of time, say a week to 10 days, and then eliminate grain. Okay. Keep those ewes on a low quality forage with no grain. Lambs are still nursing for at least a week. Okay. And by this time, the lambs are 60 days plus old. Okay. And provided that they're eating ample creep, and you're monitoring that, a week to 10 days under that scenario, those ewes can be removed. Leave the lambs in the same pen where they've been raised all their life, so they're most comfortable. Take the ewes to a different location. For the next at least a week, 10 days, maybe more, keep the nutrition on those freshly weaned ewes low. That means put them in somewhere where you're not going to dump them out on a fresh, lush pasture. All right, put them somewhere where you can control what they're eating, and just give them nutrition that's going to satisfy them in terms of their gut fill, but isn't going to give them a whole lot of nutrition. Okay, so very low quality hay, limited hay, something slightly better than straw, but not a whole lot. And using that strategy, and then after, a week to 10 days of that, those ewes should be in pretty good shape.
All right, great. Any other questions before we wrap up for tonight? Just give it a few seconds here to see if anything comes in. While we're waiting to see if any more questions come in, I do want to say that this webinar will be archived on the United Suffolk Sheep Association website, which is suffolks.org. It'll also be archived in the videos on the United Suffolk Sheep Association Facebook page. And we also have several other webinars we've hosted throughout the years there, as well as good resources for anybody who's looking to learn a little bit more about a particular topic. With that, it looks like the questions are wrapping up. Thank you so much for joining us tonight, Scott. We appreciate your time. And if anyone has any questions, Scott's contact information is on the slide that you could reach out to him. And if he doesn't know the answer, I'm sure he can find somebody who does. So with that, I thank everybody for joining us, and have a great evening.
Thanks, everyone. Thanks, Amanda.
Thanks.